Hi, everyone. So the one thing I kept about the program today is that angels, demons, and magic is probably the coolest and most attention-grabbing topic we have ever had here at the Merowitz Center. Rabbi Avi Rubenfeld, Director Chabad of Chesterfield, is going to lead a fascinating presentation about the phenomena of angels, demons, and various magical practices found in Jewish traditions and teachings. And in addition to being a brilliant rabbi and teacher, Rabbi Rubenfeld is the kindest person I've ever met. He's a true mensch, and I count him as my friend. You are here? So I would like to welcome everybody today, and without further ado, over to Rabbi Rubenfeld.
Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
I'm so sorry to hear that. No, I'm kidding. So first of all, that was very, very kind of you, Susan, and right back at you. She really set the bar high there, and I hope I'm not going to disappoint all of you with those expectations. But all joking aside, we're going to jump in. We have a lot to cover. So one of the things that I guess should start off by admitting is that when I prepare for a class, the hardest part for me is deciding of all the material that I'm going to share with you, what I shouldn't share, because unfortunately time is limited. Many of you who know me personally know that I'm not originally from St. Louis. So if you're going to ask me where I went to high school, you're not going to know the answer. But I do want to tell you that what we're going to do is speak as a New Yorker speaks. So we're going to jam a lot of information in. And if nothing else, at least you'll know there's a lot more to the topic to cover. And while it's a fascinating topic, one of the things that the Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Schneerson, who we're going to talk about in just a moment, taught us is that Torah, the word Torah, the meaning of the word means instruction. And therefore, although it might fascinate us, if it doesn't instruct our lives, then we're not learning properly. So I want you to put on those glasses, not the ones that some of you may have on already, but the glasses, the lens that you should see all of this fascinating topic of study about with the lens of what does this mean to you and me today? Okay, and that's going to be my most important takeaway that I want you to take away from today's class. Although I do have to tell you there's some fascinating, we're only going to touch the tip of the iceberg today with regard to this topic in particular, okay? And if you have questions now, that's good, write them down. We're probably going to have a little bit of time at the end for the questions. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and you'll let me know if you see that clearly. Does everybody see that? Perfect. All right, so I have to begin by telling you that much different than the kind words that Susan said, that I am a public servant here to serve the Jewish community, particularly out in West County in Chesterfield and the greater Chesterfield area. The inspiration for myself and my wife, Hanala, who are co-directors of Chabad of Chesterfield, is the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Schneerson. If you have not yet come across or studied anything about the Rebbe, I encourage you to. He, without question, is our generation's Moses, and truly an inspirational figure that each and every one of you should get to know. Here's a couple of teachings that Rebbe has taught us that I thought were relevant to this particular class. The Rebbe told us that each individual has the capacity to build communities and endow communities with life, so that every community member becomes a source of inspiration, a source of goodness, a source of light. There's pretty powerful, empowering teaching to each and every one of us. I do want to mention to the great work that Susan's doing, if I could point and highlight that, there was a time where the Rebbe highlighted the importance in particular of the elderly Jewish community studying. And he started, the Rebbe himself founded a study session that in order to get in to that club, you have to be over a certain age. We're not going to mention which age, but the purpose there was that you don't, I like to define retirement as when you quit living at work and you start working at living. And the Rebbe taught us a very powerful message that the golden years, the years when you have more free time, those are years to dedicate and devote to study of Torah, and that is the purpose of the soul from before it came to the world, while it's here, and afterwards as well. The relevant teaching in particular that Rebbe gave us that I think is definitely something that should serve as a foundation to a lot of the fascinating but sometimes far out information you can study in the Talmud and other sources about this particular topic. The Rebbe told us that this world is not a jungle. This world is God's garden. But for a garden to produce good fruit, one must work particularly hard. It takes more toil and more time. So I just want to make sure you're going to learn about some scary stuff. Might cause some people nightmares, but keep in mind, this world is not a scary world. This world is a beautiful garden. And our job is to water the plants, to make the flowers blossom. We're going to begin with a quick story. There's 3 separate topics that Susan picked. In reality, this is a class that I've given in the past. We gave this class originally around a certain time of year when some people celebrate a holiday called Halloween. And I felt that it would be appropriate to give Jewish sources for effectively Halloween is a pagan holiday. So that at least people could be aware of that even concepts such as that, the Torah has instruction about. But before we get to the other topics of angels and demons, let's discuss magic. Magic in our age has certainly seen a revival. One of my many jobs that I've had over the course of time is to be one of the scholars on a website called askmoses.com. A tremendous resource, by the way, of Jewish knowledge. Connell and myself were both scholars for many years. And there is definitely an uptick in groups in high schools and college of witchcraft and sorcery. It's amazing what the general population doesn't know about, thank God, but that happens on a regular basis is fascinating. We could talk all about that alone. But because magic has become so much more popular, probably because of Harry Potter and many of those shows that they've made based on that, I felt that for this class today, we're going to devote at least the first part of the class to magic, and then whatever remaining time we have to demons and to angels. And if we have to come back and finish up, I'm glad to do that, okay? So let's start with where this comes from in the Torah. A lot of people like to call it the Bible. Again, the word Torah means instruction. So I feel it's better to call it by the name Torah, even though it's a Hebrew word. And by the way, generally this question comes along, the magic as well as the afterlife seem to be grouped into the same category. More often than not, as a rabbi, I hear people telling me or making the assumption that magic, the afterlife, it's not a Jewish idea, it's not a Jewish belief. And they're very surprised to hear that not only is it a Jewish belief, we wrote the book on it, pardon the pun. They want to know, therefore, where is it in the Bible? So I want to start off about magic and the prohibition, which by divine providence was in the Torah, in last week's Torah portion, Kedoshim. So we read, actually Israel read it the week before, but we read the prohibition, the biblical prohibition against the Jew using or being involved in witchcraft and sorcery was the last part of last week's Torah portion. And Susan scheduled this months ago, and I'm not sure that we've communicated about that, but there's no accidents in life, and it's certainly something which is relevant. So the idea of magic, the story, the prohibition, I want to start off with the first foundation. You need to be aware that if the Torah comes to prohibit something, by definition, it means it's existing and it's real. If it doesn't exist, if it's not real, if it's just sleight of hand, the Torah would not have to prohibit it because it would be a useless mitzvah, it would be empty. You don't have to make a rule for something that isn't there, isn't a possibility. And we're talking about divine rules, divine commandments. We're not talking about man-made rules. Some of those are definitely empty and extra. So we'll start with the relevant magic lessons, the prohibitions that the Torah tells us, going back to King Saul. In front of you on your screen is an actual statue that was recovered that they made of Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, the first Jewish king. In the prophets, and I like to give you the sources in case you want to look it up yourself. It's in the book of Shemuel, Samuel the prophet, and you can look up the story that you're about to hear is in Shmuel Aleph, the first of the two books of Samuel, in chapter 28. Okay, so this is where that story comes from, and the story is as follows. Towards the end, the very end of Saul's life, he fought his last battle with the Plishtim. In English, they call them the Philistines. The word Plishti, unfortunately, I think there's a group today who wants to try to trace themselves back to the Plishtim, and they call themselves the Palestinians, really came from the Romans. But the Plishtim were an invading nation. That's what the word Plishti actually means, that they would go try to conquer other nations around them and travel by sea and so on and so forth. And those were very tough days for the Jewish people because the Philistines, the Plishtim, had amassed a huge army and had come to fight with the Jews. And Shaul, the Jewish king, had called up his military, and the Jewish army was camped in a place called Gilboa. If you go to Israel, you can visit that place today. And when he stood atop Mount Gilboa, Har Gilboa, he looked down at the mighty, vast, way more numerous Philistine army. His spirits fell. He was the leader of the Jewish people, but he was at a loss as how to proceed. He wanted to hear from God directly because that's what Jews did, to know whether he should go to war, to know whether he should retreat, whether he should give up. However, how do you ask for God's opinion? So Shmuel Hanavi, the prophet that was one of the great Jewish prophets, and Shmuel Hanavi is the one here. You see Shmuel actually anointing the second Jewish king. This is King David. Shmuel Hanavi has the merit of anointing the first three Jewish kings. He was one of the great, great prophets of all time. And Shmuel, this is him, another depiction of him. Shmuel was not an easy child to have. His mother, Hannah, taught us how to pray the silent prayer because she was praying at the temple because she had not been blessed with a child. And Eli HaKohen, the Kohen Gadol of the time, saw this woman standing in the temple praying, and her lips were moving, but no words were coming out. And he says to her, "Are you drunk?" And she said, "No, I'm not drunk. I'm praying for a child." So he gave her a blessing that she should have a child, and she promised him that if I have a child, after I wean him, I will bring him to you so he can serve God. Shmuel Hanavi was raised in the temple, in the what was called the tabernacle, the Mishkan, and he discovered that he became a prophet. He was a very humble person himself. Shmuel Hanavi, unfortunately, at this point in time in Shaul's life, passed away already. And Shaul himself, as the first Jewish king, just so you're aware that the Torah testifies he was an extremely humble person himself, also had the merit of having prophecy come through him. However, he was no longer at that time meriting prophetic revelation, not even by dream, which is a famous method that prophets were able to elicit the prophecy from God, called a nevuas chaloim, a prophecy that you would do certain things before you went to bed, and you woke up in the morning and you had a fax, so to speak, you had a message from God. But nothing he did worked. There was radio silence from heaven. Now, in those days, there was an established custom that if you didn't have access to a prophet and you needed to get a prophecy from God, a direction from God that was relevant to the Jewish people as a whole, you would consult with the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. Now, many of you have heard of the breastplate that the high priest has worn. Are you familiar with the breastplate? Does anybody know how many stones it had on the breastplate? There were 12 different colored stones, each of them representing one of the Jewish tribes. And they had words engraved on them, the names of the tribe, as well as the names of some of the Jewish prophets and leaders, so particularly the patriarchs, the matriarchs, so that ultimately through the stones, you had every letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And the custom was, we call that, by the way, the Choshen Mishpat is the name of the breastplate. But what gave the Choshen Mishpat, so to speak, its life, I like to call it the chip that made the computer work, so to speak, was the Urim V'Tumim. Have you heard those terms, Urim V'Tumim? Urim V'Tumim means the name of God that was written on the parchment that was placed inside that. So the king would come, or whoever it was that was representing the Jewish people, and consult with the Urim V'Tumim, the soul of the breastplate, and ask it for guidance from God. And the system was, this is before, computers at home or smartphones and devices that you can pull up and turn on your screen. The system of communication back then, which was high-tech technology, by the way, was that the stones would light up and you would decode the message that God gave us. However, even though you would imagine Shaul HaMelech went to go consult with the Kohen Gadol to find out, the problem was that Shaul had an issue that led up to this problem to begin with, which was that he was trying to kill, at that point in time, the next king, David HaMelech, happened to be his son-in-law, by the way, and he found out that the Kohanim had hid David. So he had the Kohanim, including the Kohen Gadol, killed. And then the Talmud tells us that he was suffering from a bout of insanity at the time. So he had nobody to go to. He couldn't consult with the Kohen. He couldn't consult with no prophets that were available to him. He wasn't receiving prophecy. As a result, the book of Samuel tells us, the book of Shmuel teaches us that he had only one option left. And that was to go seek the advice of a professional witch. And what is a professional witch? So the book tells us in Shmuel that she was a master of the black art of a magic called Oiv. Now the Torah prohibits the magic, the sorcery of Oiv and Yedoni in particular, prohibits all magic, but I guess those were the most commonly practiced or well-known or maybe the most practical and useful. And he went to search for a professional witch it was a form of genuine sorcery that was outlawed by the Torah. Now, how Shaul could even think of doing something that the Torah said is prohibited, and never mind actually do it, we're going to get to later on, okay? I want to tell you the message there. But Shaul himself, as the Jewish king, had an obligation to purge the Jewish people in the land of Israel of this magic of Oiv and Yedoni, which was very commonplace in the nations that lived there before. And he did so very effectively, actually, because the king of the Jewish people has many obligations on behalf of the whole people. One of them is to purge them of sorcery. So where was Shaul, the great king of Israel, with only one choice left to communicate and find out from God what he should be doing with this war? Where was he going to go find an Oiv master, and how would he get to her? So he sent out his servants searching high and low until they actually found that in a city up north in Israel called Ein Dar, there was an Oiv master, a witch who was no longer practicing publicly because she was afraid of her for her life. And Shaul decided he is going to meet with her and ask her to find out from Samuel the prophet, who had already passed on, what to do. So Shaul changed out of his royal garments and he dressed like a common person. And in that outfit, so nobody should be able to recognize him as the king. And with a heavy heart, due to the unfolding events that were going on around him, he set out for the city of Ein Dar, accompanied with his two top officers who were very righteous people themselves, Avner and Amsha. Now the Oiv master, this witch that they found, she trembled to no end when this man arrived and demanded that she raise the spirit of Shmuel Hanavi, Samuel the prophet. Everybody following with me? Okay, hope I didn't lose anybody. If there's anything unclear so far, Don't be afraid to ask. I'll be happy to repeat. What do you think if you were in her shoes, knowing that the Jewish king would have you killed? Would you say, sure, I'll do that for you? Or would you refuse? Of course, she said, absolutely not. She said, look, you know what Shaul HaMelech, not knowing she was talking to Shaul himself. She said, you know what he did and how he cut the Avos and the Yadainim from the land. There's no more witch and sorcerers allowed and living in our land. Why do you lay a snare for my life? Why are you going to cause me to die? And Shaul, without her knowing who he was, made a vow in front of her. He promised her that no harm would come to her for doing this. So she received the promise. She felt she had no other choice. Here was a very tall, imposing looking person with two very, very strong people with him. So she said, who should I raise up for you? And Shaul said, I want you to raise up Shmuel Hanavi. The witch took a certain bone. I'm not going to tell you the whole formula. Don't worry. And I don't know it. And she placed it under her armpits. And she performed all the traditional rituals of the Oiv masters. And she raised the spirit of the prophet Shmuel. Suddenly, a great fright fell over this witch, this Oiv master, when she saw Shmuel Hanavi rise. By the way, it tells us he was upside down, his feet first, before her. But the part that freaked her out, it totally nonplussed her, was that he was in the form of a living human being. Normally, when they communicated with the dead, it was in the form, it came up through the shape of animals or other things. In this case, it was a human being. He appeared to be alive, but upside down. She absolutely freaked out. And she immediately understood, she was a tremendous expert, that her customer who called this person had to have some special merits to have a person come back from the dead in the form of a human being. So she realized instantly that the person in front of her was no ordinary man, but the actual king of the Jewish people, Shaul HaMelech, in all of his glory himself. So she screamed at the king, why did you deceive me when you are Shaul? Now Shaul had never told her. Shaul HaMelech calmed her down. He said, don't scream and do not fear. I promised you no harm would come to you. Tell me, who do you see? Which gives us an insight that she was able to see Shmuel. Saul, King Shaul, was not able to see him. He was just able to hear him. So she described who she saw. I see an old man rising and he's wrapped in a cloak. Shaul realized immediately from her description that it was indeed Shmuel, because Shmuel would wear a cloak that his mother Chana, you may remember I told you that Chana brought him as a young child still to live in the Beis Hamikdash, in the tabernacle. So she created a special, she knit this cloak for him that he treasured. It was sort of his security blanket, his connection to his mother. So Shmuel immediately, when she described this cloak, knew that he was actually Shmuel. Saul knew that this was actually Shmuel. And immediately, he was able to hear Shmuel Hanavi's voice. And he said, Shmuel said to Shaul, why have you disturbed me to raise me? And Shaul was petrified. Shaul, with a trembling voice, he said, it's very hard for me. The Plishtim are upon me and my people, the Jewish, our people, and God has left me, and I have not been answered any further, not through prophets and not in dreams. So Shaul was telling Shmuel why he needed to ask him in such an unkosher way, so to speak. So Shaul heard Shmuel's response. He said, and why do you ask me when God has departed from you? Why are you coming to me? So very interesting, just to pause for a moment from the story that's in the book of prophets in Shmuel. The Medrash tells us that Shmuel was saying to Shaul, now that I'm in the world of truth, I can tell you the entire truth that I could not tell you before. I told you then that God had ripped away the kingdom from you and given it to your comrade who is better than you. Now, and only now, I can reveal to you that God meant David, by your comrade that's better than you. So this fellow you were trying to kill is actually the one who Hashem made into a king. No, Shmuel told Saul, that God does this to you not by mistake and not for naught, but rather because you as the Jewish king did not fulfill the commandment that God commanded you, which is that you did not execute the entire nation of Amalek, which is a very hard, difficult idea for Jewish people who are by nature nurturing and merciful. To wipe out an entire nation is a very hard thing. And Shaul struggled with that. As a result of that shortcoming, that failure, God took away the kingdom from him and gave it to King David. So essentially what Shmuel Hanavi from the world, from the afterlife, which the Rebbe, by the way, was not fond of using the word afterlife. I should correct that. The Rebbe would say the next phase of life, because there is no afterlife. The soul never was born and never dies. It only goes to a different dimension, so to speak, a different consciousness. So Shmuel said essentially to Saul, that because of that incident, but both, unfortunately, you and your son, Yehonasan, who was a tremendous, tremendous person. Yehonasan was King David's best friend. The Talmud uses, which is much to the chagrin of many people, the perfect example of true love doesn't choose a husband and a wife. From all the characters throughout history, the Talmud points to the relationship between David and his brother-in-law, Yehonasan, or some people call him Yonatan, as the example of a true love that was not dependent on anything, that was not for their own, for a benefit for themselves. What Rabbi Tursky of blessed memory referred to as fish love. You can look it up. So Shmuel told Shaul that unfortunately you and your son are both going to die tomorrow, and that Israel as a nation is going to fall into the Plishtim, to the Philistines' hands, and suffer greatly. So Shaul asked him a question. He said, if I flee, if I run away, will I be saved? And Shmuel told him that he would, just to finish the story, not to leave it as a cliffhanger. But he also reassured him that if he went to war like a king should and led his people into battle, that even though he would die, he would be with him in the Garden of Eden. He wouldn't be punished. He wouldn't suffer further. And the next day, being who Shaul was, knowing the outcome of this war, he went into battle and led the Jewish people, and he died, and his son was killed, and he actually, right before they captured him, fell on his own sword and died. So now that's the rest of the story. But I want to analyze the magic part of the story. All of that was just a prelude so that you would understand the biblical story that tells us about practicing black magic in this case. The Rebbe asks many, many questions, and I think you could sum them up. And he says, apparently, the entire story that you just heard from the book of Samuel doesn't make any sense. We learned that Shmuel gets angry at King Shaul for disturbing him from his rest. But like I told you earlier, the real big question comes right from the Torah itself. In the end of Parsha Kedoshim, last week's Torah portion, the last verse, by the way, it's the last verse. It says, and a man or woman who has in them Oiv and Yedoni, these two forms of sorcery, will surely die. So how is it possible that Shaul, the Jewish king who was a tzaddik, a righteous man, should raise the spirit of the dead using this prohibited method of Oiv? And who did he lift? Who did he raise up? Shmuel HaNavi, the prophet. It's something that's strictly forbidden by the Torah. Also, I mentioned to you earlier, Avner and Amsha, who were Shaul's two top officers, the Talmud testifies that not only were they tzaddikim, they were people who did not do a single sin their entire life. They weren't just nice people who were majority good and you know, they were perfect people. They accompanied Shaul to go do something prohibited by the Torah? Doesn't make any sense. So why didn't Shmuel rebuke Shaul for practicing black magic? Why did he just tell him, why are you disturbing my rest? Anybody have any answers? Did this question keep you up at night until now? Or is it only because you didn't know it? So the Rebbe has the answer for us. He tells us that something very, very fascinating. He said that Shaul, since he was the king, and he went and saw the Philistines surrounding the Jewish people, he realized that this is a question of life and death. In Hebrew, we refer to that as pikuach nefesh. Have you heard that term? In Judaism, there is nothing that stands before the concept of saving a life. The Torah tells us about all the commandments in the Torah, v'hachai bahem, that you must live with them. And the oral Torah, the Talmud teaches us that that means that you don't die for a mitzvah, you have to live, except 3 mitzvot. And those 3 mitzvot are murdering someone else. If someone comes to you and says, kill this person or I'm going to kill you, you got to say, here I am, kill me. You're not allowed to murder somebody to save yourself. Idol worship. Someone says, perform idol worship or I'm going to kill you. You say, I'm ready to give up my life. And the final words that Jews throughout the ages have given up their life with was Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel. God is one, essentially saying there's no purpose to not connect to God and, so to speak, live a physical life. And the third one is inappropriate relations. If someone says to you, I'm going to kill you if you don't do A, B, and C, that's not appropriate. You say, I'm sorry, you'll have to take my life. So those are the only 3 exceptions that you give up your life for. Other than that, you have to save a Jewish life at all costs. You break any Jewish mitzvah, any Jewish law, any Jewish restriction that there is. So Shaul, King Saul, essentially realized that with the Jewish people's lives at stake, not having an answer, he's allowed to break this prohibition of using black magic in order to find out from God what he should do. So that's the justification of why he did, which is why Shmuel did not chastise him, tell him off for using black magic, because it was a case that was permitted by Jewish law. In practice, it didn't help, by the way. It wasn't the purpose, but at least he had a justification. But what the Rebbe tells us is much more important in a talk that he gave, just so you know where this is. If you want to read it a little more, it's in the talks that the Rebbe gave from the year 5744 or 1984. The Rebbe gave a talk on the Torah portion of Kedoshim, actually. And the Rebbe taught us the idea of understanding the framework, so to speak, of magic in general. That witchcraft and black magic, and all forms of sorcery, by the way, not just the 2 that the Torah mentions, mainly only existed during the era when there were prophets, when there were Jewish prophets conveying to the world God's word. Let's back up a moment. I should explain a concept first. I hope that you're all familiar with this concept, but I don't want to assume it, so I'm going to explain it. So, King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, the wisest man that ever lived. In Proverbs, he wrote many of the books of the Bible, or as we call them, the Proverbs. It's in Tanakh. We call it Tanakh, so it's Ketuvim. It's in the scriptures. Shlomo HaMelech tells us that God created a balanced world. That if there is something in the world on the side of holiness, it has the potential for the opposite of holiness. I want to ask everybody, not a rhetorical question, and it might be a very uncomfortable question for you, but don't be afraid to answer. You have 5 fingers on your hand here, right? Which is the holy finger? Can everybody, I'm gonna look at the screen now. Can everybody hold up their holy finger for me? Don't worry, you could only get 4 of them wrong. Okay? So actually, effectively, I asked you to give me the finger. The middle finger is your holy finger. So this was your opportunity to give the rabbi the finger, but okay. So the middle finger is holy because that's the finger dedicated that Jewish men are supposed to put tefillin on. Did you know that? Because that's the tefillin finger, it has an inherent holiness to it. because it could be used for a holy act, designated as the finger for the holy act, it also has the potential to let other drivers know what you think of them. That's where it comes from. If it wasn't the holy finger, it never would have come up with the idea of using that to curse people out. So I want you to understand that the world, by definition, if it has the potential for holy, it also has the potential for opposite of holy. Or if it's opposite of holy, it also has a holy purpose as well. You know, there are some people who say how terrible the internet is. The internet has, what are we doing right now? We're studying Torah over the internet. It has the potential for tremendous good if you use it for good. Or, God forbid, it could be used for the opposite of good. Everything has potential to go one way or the other. So that's the precursor I wanted you to understand, that the Rebbe is teaching us about magic. If there were prophets in the world that were conveying the word of God, there has to be the potential to communicate and hear, so to speak, divine messages, or the afterlife talking with you. Again, I don't like the term afterlife, but messages that are not privy to the general population through a method that's unholy. Why is that? Because otherwise you live in a world without free choice. If the only way to do something is a kosher, holy way, then there's no room for you to have free choice and to do it the incorrect way. So what God gave us is a series of choices. In order to have choice, you have to have the wrong choice available as well. You understand? Everybody following? So I see there's a question here. Very good. So let me review the Rebbe's answer. Shaul saw the opportunity to receive God's instruction, even though it was going to be done through a method that's normally prohibited to a Jew from doing, as a question or a matter of life or death. If he would be able to receive through drawing Shmuel back to tell him what to do, he felt it was going to lead him to be able to know how to succeed, as he did in the past, with the war with the Plishtim. This is not the first war that Shaul had fought with the Plishtim, with the Philistines. You probably know about the war before, and I probably assumed that everybody understood that, so I didn't explain it, and I won't assume, I'll explain it very quickly. Has anybody heard of the famous story of David and Goliath? David was fighting for the king Shaul when he went and approached Goliath. Who was Goliath? Goliath in Hebrew is Goliath. He was the head, or the big soldier, the largest, he was a giant that represented the Philistine army. Shaul was the king. He didn't have anybody who would go to a suicide mission and fight with this giant of a man. David came along. He wasn't a soldier in the army even. He heard Goliath making fun of the Jewish people and making fun of God. And he said, this can't go on. There can't be a person embarrassing and insulting God and his people. And he asked Shaul if he can go. And Shaul had a prophecy and an instruction to let him go. So Shaul knew that if God gave him a message, he would succeed in overcoming what he saw as naturally the inconquerable army. So he figured if he could get God's instruction, he would succeed at the war as well. In practice, the instruction was, this is the end of your life. But he thought that he might be able to save his life and the Jewish people's life as a whole. Okay, does that answer your question, Alice? So going back to the message from that story, right? So the criticism that Shmuel, Samuel the prophet, gave to Shaul wasn't, you shouldn't have done that sin, you shouldn't use black magic, which Shaul himself knew good and well, but rather it was that that you shouldn't have disturbed my rest. Essentially, there's no positive outcome for you. What the Rebbe teaches us on this story and about magic in general, as I told you, is that as long as there were still prophets conveying God's word in a holy manner through a holy communication, there was available and there was common practice, unfortunately, of the opposite side of holiness, of black magic and sorcery. However, now that real prophecy had departed from the Jewish people back then, unfortunately, for many, many, many years now, 2,000 years, we have been in exile. Most people don't necessarily really understand what exile is. Exile means we have radio silence from God. In the time of the temple, when the Beis HaMikdash, when the holy temple stood in Jerusalem, when God's house stood there, you wouldn't go, you know, today we like to say that if you talk to God, you're not crazy. If he answers you, that's when you're crazy, right? Have you heard that expression? That's why they call a prophet a meshugana. He's a little crazy. But in reality, in the times that the temple stood, you would bring an offering in the temple. God would send down a fire in the shape of a lion to accept your offering. There was communication, open communication, something that you would see with your eyes that was tangible. Unfortunately, we don't know that. For 2,000 years, we're living without that communication. So therefore, the Rebbe points out that black magic also has left the world. If the holy side is not available to us, the opposite of the holy side is not available as well. Okay, I hope that's clear for everybody. So you don't have to worry about black magic. However, I should tell you, not to get you nervous, that actually, in reality, we have had prophecy return to the Jewish people in the recent generations. And I believe, and this is only my observation from having to answer on Ask Moses many, 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 many times, of people who are experiencing groups that are practicing, unfortunately, witchcraft and sorcery with children in high schools and even as young as elementary schools, that because we're getting closer to the time of Mashiach, we're in the generation, the Rebbe told us that we're in the final generation of exile, but also the first generation of redemption. We are both the generation that is going to leave exile, as well as the generation that are unlike the generation, can everybody hear me still? Okay. Unlike the generation that left Egypt, didn't make it into Israel, our job is to make that transition. All right. So just to end the magic element, and hopefully we'll get to if we still have time, let me just see where we're holding time-wise. We're quickly approaching, we're running out of time. I'm going to start speaking a little bit faster, everybody. Okay. So we'll get to the next part, which is fascinating as well. I hope, even more fascinating, I believe. So the important thing to know is that today, the majority of people that are quote unquote practicing magic, it's not real. And if there is anybody practicing magic, it's because there's also the side of prophecy, and you have the ability to go and see open miracles, as we've seen by the Rebbe many times, by the way. And I've merited to be involved with people who have literally seen miracles. Actually, just so you know, and this is not theory, earlier this week I received a call from a pastor, not Jewish, who lives here, who's been helping and Chabad with a certain project. And he told me, these are his words, not mine, that Rabbi, it's a long story, it's someone's health and a medical issue, but he said, I just got a call from the doctor. He says, Rabbi, I believe I just saw a miracle, meaning I experienced the miracle as a result of the good work that I'm doing. So you see people who are seeing miracles and having these kinds of experiences now much more, because prophecy has also been returning to the Jewish people for several generations. And we're not going to have time to address that in its full, but at least in the topic of magic, I wanted to introduce that idea that the only reason there's magic in the world is because there has to be the option to do it in a non-kosher, non-permissible, non-mitzvah way, as opposed to on its own. All right. So the ultimate thing to remember about magic, we're going to get to actually in the slideshow if we have enough time, but let's skip there just so we don't lose the message. Okay, and we'll come back to all the other interesting stuff that I hope is gonna really resonate with everybody here today. So the message that I want you to know is this message, and we're going to go back and do the rest of it together, okay? But magic is definitely a prohibition for a Jewish person. You're not allowed to practice it. You're not allowed to consult with it. You're not allowed to use it for any purposes, okay? This was the exception that I told you, right? If it's a case of saving a life and so on and so forth. Magic, the reason why it's prohibited is because it leads you away from God. Let me ask you a question. Who do you give credit to when a magician makes a magic trick? The magician, right? Who is the one who is in truth creating the world and making everything happen? God. That shows you that it's not a holy thing. That's why magic is forbidden. Whereas a miracle is just like magic. It alters nature. But when you witness a miracle, like this fellow called up the rabbi to tell him, God just performed a miracle for me. That leads you to God. That's holiness. The definition of holiness is something that brings you to God. The definition of evil or something that's unholy is something that leads you away from God. On the last lesson on the topic of magic, everybody here knows, what does a magician say when they perform a magic trick? For some reason, we all have heard that word, right? Whether it's by a birthday party, performance, or whatever it is. Does anybody want to share with us? What are the famous words a magician says? Susan will put
Abracadabra.
Abracadabra. Bob, well said. Just like that, and his image appeared on the screen as he said it. What does abracadabra mean? What language is abracadabra in? Abracadabra is actually a takeoff the Hebrew or Aramaic words abracadabra. I will create like my words. That's Hebrew. So a magician is saying, I'm creating, not God. I'm going to create this by my words. That is the famous magic expression. And that's why magic is forbidden and prohibited, because it doesn't give the credit to God. It leads you away from God. Whereas something which is a miracle, something which is holy, that leads you to God, to giving thanks to Hashem and to realize that God controls nature. All right, so that's our class on magic. Susan, I'm going to ask you as the host of today's class, should we leave our demons for a different week and answer questions, or should we try to cover the next 10, 15 minutes on the topic of demons and angels?
I think we should try to cover a little bit more, and we can. The Zoom won't shut off exactly at 3 o'clock or anything. So if we go a few minutes over, I think that's okay. And thank you everyone for hanging with us.
All right, sounds good. Does everybody agree with Susan? Because this is a democracy. You can all vote, and we're going to do what we want anyway, right? Mm-hmm. So, all right. So let's jump into today's second topic at hand here. We're going to try not to give you a headache. So just so you know, the rest of this topic, angels and demons, and you noticed I switched around the order from the original class to talk about this first, because I felt that magic is perhaps, certainly timely because of the Torah portion, but maybe more relevant today as well, regardless. But I want to give you at least some background on demons and angels and what they are, where they come from, what the significance of they are, okay? So let's jump right in over here. This is one of the great quotes that I saw. Back when religion knew how to scare people, they made these images. These are statues. These are real statues that they have. Notice they have security cameras there. I guess they're not as scary. So just so you know, there are actually 8 different forms of magic and sorcery mentioned in the Torah. I mentioned to you earlier today 2 of them. Does anybody remember what they're called? What are the names of those magics? Oiv and Yedoni. That's what the Torah specifically prohibits, but you should know in Egypt, they practice all those forms of magic. Now, before we get to distracted again with magic, I want to mention the holy side of demons and sorcery and so on and so forth. And if you were asked to figure out what in the world would be as a kid, we always played a game of opposites, right? So what's the opposite of right? Left. What's the opposite of up? Down. What's the opposite of a demon?
Angel.
Okay, and that's the way we say it. So I'm going to tell you in a very big way that's correct, but there's also a tzaddik. A tzaddik is a human being, flesh and blood, because a demon, I guess, you shouldn't say the D at the end, right? The demon is a physical form. An angel is a spiritual form. Did you ever think about that? And I'm going to show you some pictures, some depictions of actual demons that were witnessed and spoken about and described and even drawn about over history. So I want you to recognize that an angel is not an accurate opposite of a demon, because an angel has no physical form. An angel is purely a spiritual form. Another way of understanding that very quickly is an angel is essentially a program executing its code, has no free choice. It's a spiritual divine energy fulfilling and doing exactly what it was created for, what it was programmed to do. And it can do nothing else, okay? A demon is actually a lot more like a person. And in that sense, a human being like a tzaddik, this is a beautiful painting of the Baal Shem Tov taking his Hasidim on a journey, and the tradition that we have was that the Baal Shem Tov's horse would oftentimes have what's called kvitzas haderech. So in this picture, the artist, Kleinman, a great artist, drew this picture describing kvitzas haderech. Literally, kvitzas haderech we find in the Torah with Jacob and with many others. It literally means that the road folds underneath the person. So God shortens your journey, so to speak. But regardless, the Baal Shem Tov would have his students sit in his wagon, and they would be studying and doing things. And without another explanation that is logical or scientific, they would reach destinations that were physically impossible for a horse and wagon to reach. They would travel expanses that were much farther than what a normal horse and buggy could reach. So this is the way he depicts that. So I wanted at least to paint that picture to you, that a demon is not really the opposite of an angel, okay? Because at least the angel is only spiritual and the demon is actually manifest in the physical. Now, a lot of people mistakenly think that a demon is this is the definition of what a demon actually was. It was a force that was there just to develop itself. That's why it's considered unholy. Something that's holy serves God. And a demon by nature will always live to go against anything positive and good. However, and they have so many more of the physical character traits that, or not character traits, but characteristics that we as human beings have, okay? A lot of people think that mistakenly that a demon is like a short circuit, that God made a mistake and they're the product of not quite making the human beings first. And that's not a correct perspective. That's not a Jewish perspective for sure. So it's not that God had a short circuit and that's why there's all of these. They actually are, and in Hebrew, we refer to demons as shadim or shin dalid. There was a time when people would refrain from saying their name so as not to give them any life force from their own soul, because God created the world with speech, and we're all we all manifest a piece of God called a neshama, a soul within us, that it has creative force and creative powers. So people would refrain from saying a shade and pronouncing the word. Instead, they just said its letters, Shin and Dalet. Okay, so their description of the Talmud is that the demons were of a physical form. They had feet, and their feet were bird feet, like a bird today has feet, claws. They had bird feet, and they had the body of either an animal or a person, or sometimes both. They ate, they multiplied, they had offspring, and they died. Demons would die also. They had the ability, I'm just describing to you what the Talmud, and I'll show you the Talmud. I actually have the text. If anybody would like me to send it to you, you can have it in Hebrew and in English, or in Aramaic and English. And they had the ability to fly across from one end of the earth to the other in an instant. They didn't have spatial limitations like we do. They live in places that we cannot live, and they have the knowledge of angels. They know the future. They are not bound by time, but they live within time to a degree. They are not God. Okay, so that is what the Talmud tells us that demons are, through many different stories and many different descriptions of what demons are. It tells us what they do, where they come from, and so on and so forth. Were they created? They were 100% created. In Pirkei Avot, in the Talmud, it tells us that the demons were created on Friday Eve, the first Friday night, at twilight, at the time when a Jewish woman lights Shabbat candles, which every Jewish woman should do, bringing light and warmth into the world. On the first Friday Eve, God created, at that time, before Shabbat actually started, in that little twilight period, we call it Bein HaShmoshes, God created demons. So they were created intentionally, and I told you a little bit about what they look like. Let me tell you some of the famous examples that we find of Shadim, okay? Now, before we do that, the Maharal of Prague told us that Shadim, again, Shadim is the Hebrew word for demon. Shadim are a consequence of creation as opposed to a direct product of creation, whereas human beings and angels are a direct product. Therefore, they remain less connected to the Creator, and therefore that allows them to unite with others that feel separate from God. That's, so to speak, their domain. People who disconnect from God sort of could connect if they open themselves up to it. In today's day and age, it's not possible without I'll give you what's the expression? I'll give you the spoiler alert that at a certain point in time, the tzaddikim of the time, the righteous people of the generation, got together and they banned Shadim from having access to any place where human beings live. So they have no access to us whatsoever, and therefore today they might exist, but they're not something that you'll ever interact with, just so you know, okay? I want to explain quickly what the idea that the Maharal is teaching us is, with a little quick depiction here. Godliness, or in Kabbalistic terms, Elokut, is on top. That's the creative energy. And if it goes straight, if it goes in a healthy manner, that's holiness, that's Kedusha. However, there's always, we see this in all things in nature as well, by the way, as a result of this, there's always some loss, so to speak. There's always some energy being lost or funneled to the side. An electrician will tell you that electricity travels around the copper wire or any form of wire, not within the wire. And there's always a loss. You can have a perfect circuit of electricity, using electricity as a metaphor here for godliness. There will always be some loss in that circuit. You're always losing some of that energy. Einstein was of the opinion that energy is not lost, it just is transferred. And he was right on and spot on in the sense that when you lose divine energy, the Yashut doesn't get lost. It doesn't not exist, but it sustains the tumma, the impurity, or in this case, the demons of the world. Okay? So, not to get too Kabbalistic on you, God created the world with 4 elements. Fire, which is energy, water, which is liquid, earth, which is solid, and wind, which is gas. So the angels, as I told you before, have no physical form. They, although demons have a lot of the attributes like angels, they have wings, they fly, they have an insight into the future. Demons are also human-like in that they eat and drink, they reproduce, and they die. Their appearance, though, is they have physical appearances like bird feet and cow hooves and the split tongue and goat-like. These are all descriptions of the Talmud. None of these things I'm making up for you, I promise. So they have a split tongue. This is probably where a lot of the ideas of a devil came from. And they could take on any form. They're shapeshifters, by the way. So before we get too far in there, I do want to tell you a couple of the famous examples, and these are demons. They're not the Satan. They're not an angel. The Satan, by the way, is a Jewish concept, but he is not an angel that has equal power to God. He has no free choice. He's an angel, not a demon, carrying out God's will to allow us free choice. A demon is not an angel. It's not a direct creation. It is a product, an offshoot, so to speak, of lost energy. Not lost, but the loss of energy, so to speak. I like to give it a more updated, modern metaphor that a demon is a lot like a battery pack, a place where divine energy is stored that's not on the side of holiness, but is not going back to God, and therefore gets stored there. So that's what a demon's function and purpose is, to make a long story short, okay? You want to hear some of the famous, I know we're out of time at this point. You want to hear some of the famous demons, or should we stop here?
Okay, give us a few.
Okay. It must be too tempting, right? So Lilith is probably the most famous demon that ever existed. Has everybody here heard of Lilith? If you heard of her, it's not such a big deal, right? If you met her, you're in trouble. So Lilith was a woman seductor. She is, according to many places in many of the Jewish texts, her main occupation is she's a baby snatcher. Again, I want to make it very clear to you. These were realities in the days of old. They are no longer, after a certain era, they were no longer capable of having an effect on any human being whatsoever, unless a human being specifically did something that let the demon have access to their life. Okay? So you have nothing to be worried about, but that doesn't take away the truth of what has been available to them at a certain time, at a certain era. And again, it's not that they have free choice either, and it's not that God didn't control the world. It's just that when they are a divine energy force that is not for the side of holiness, they play the role, take advantage of the opportunity of being able to take the divine energy in creation. Let me explain that to you very, very briefly, but we're not going to do a just job of it because we're not going to be able to give it to you in full. What is the single most godlike act a human being can do? When are you most godlike? Susan, you've done this. Any Jewish woman here, men contribute, but the women are the ones who do this act.
Giving birth.
Giving birth. When you create a new life, you are literally like God. You're a partner with God in creation. You are creating a new human being. It's an amazing accomplishment. Just so you know, every Jewish man or woman, every mitzvah you do, you're also creating life. However, we physically see it when a child is born. So Lilith was a child snatcher. She would take the divine energy of when a opportunity arose where the divine energy was there to create a human life, but would not go on to create the human life. She would take that divine energy. Do you know how much divine energy a godly soul is? It's more powerful than the entire world. So Lilith loved to take essentially any potential life that didn't actually become a human being. Okay? Which is very relevant to a lot of the discussions that are going on in today's day and age as well. And that was her we to this day, even though Lilith certainly doesn't have access, have some traditions that Jews are instructed to do after marital intercourse to specifically protect the divine energy you brought into the world from running off to Lilith. Okay, I'll give you one of the practices of washing your hands, just like you wash before bread or washing in the morning. So purifying your hands is one of the practices we do. So there's instruction to ensure that all of the divine energy you brought into the world remains on the side of holiness and doesn't go into the battery pack, as my metaphor, or into the side of Lilith, who loves and lives for that. Okay? We're told, by the way, in reputable sources in Kabbalah, that if a baby is laughing in his sleep, you should wake him up as an infant. And I know the expression is, you never wake a sleeping baby, because it says that he would be dreaming of Lilith. Again, in today's day and age, most likely it's not something that's related to her. She doesn't have access to any living human being. That's some of the details it tells us about Lilith. Again, I have a source sheet. If you want to go through, we could read through some of the Talmud together. I could share that on the screen as well if you want to, but we're not going to have time for that. So what I'll do is I can send it to anybody who wants. Susan, you'll give him I'll tell you now, my email address is rabbiavi@gmail.com. I'll be happy to send you all my notes so that you could read through it on your own, which has the access of the Talmud, where all of these ideas are coming from, or the sources, if it's not the Talmud, in Hebrew and in English, so you can read it and understand it. Another one of the famous ones is Agras Bas Machlas. He pops up, he was a mazik, he was a vandal throughout different places. And he actually had an army of mazikim, an army of these demons that would go and wreak havoc in places. He was a destructor. Chanina ben Doisa actually met, Agras was a her, not a he, by the way. I apologize. Chanina ben Doisa met her, and she said that had it not been declared in heaven, that she told Chanina ben Doisa was a great, great, great sage, a holy person. She said, had it not been declared in heaven that you were such a great man because of your Torah study, she said that I would have destroyed you. So he recognized an opportunity, and he answered her in the Talmud. The story tells us that if that's the case, then I banish you from inhabiting areas where people can be found. And that is, all the demons started to tremble. And she said, you can't do that to me. And that was, just so you know, the source that I referred to before, Chanina ben Doisa, when all demons lost access to any place where a human being is. Okay, so now you know the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say. All right, we're not going to have time to go through the rest of them, but I'm happy to share that in writing if anybody wants. This is the destructors that I was telling you about over here, correct? They're wrecking havoc. But the Talmud we're not going to get to over there. Lilith, we covered. Igas Vas Machlas. Kurdaikas would be a little bit more that we can chew today. I just wanted to show you at least minimally this picture. This picture over here is a very well-known depiction, and it actually has a Jewish source to it. A lot of the depictions don't necessarily have a Jewish source. This one does. You see this big guy over here on the left side? What does he look like to you? Pretty scary dude, right? His name is Ashmedai. He is the king of demons. And this Jew sitting on the camel over here is Benayahu. He was Shlomo HaMelech's right-hand man. He was Shlomo HaMelech's top general. And King Solomon, knowing all the secrets of the Torah in the world, gave Benayahu the ability to capture the king of demons and bring him to him. The Jewish king doesn't go to the king of demons. And if we had time, I would have told you the whole story. It's a fascinating story. We know how he accomplished it and how he did it. And the reason King Solomon brought Ashmedai to him was so that he would be able to help him capture the shamir worm that he used to cut the stones to build the temple. It wasn't for selfish purposes, God forbid. just so you know the rest of the story there. But this is an actual depiction that they have of Ashmedai, who is the king of demons that was captured. Just so you know, the book of Kohelet. Has anybody here heard of the book of Kohelet? Kohelet, in English, they translate it, I don't know why, because it's a made-up word, but they translate Kohelet into an English word that's much harder to say, which is Ecclesiastes. Have you heard of Ecclesiastes referred to? What does Kohelet mean? Who is Kohelet? Kohelet is a book of sayings of King Solomon. So why does he call himself Kohelet throughout the book? Why doesn't he say Shlomo? I, Shlomo. He says, no, I, Kohelet. And the answer is because after King Solomon captured Ashmedai, who is the king of demons, and demons are shapeshifters, they had the ability to take any form. Ashmedai actually figured out how to free himself, take the shape of King Solomon himself, and he actually captured, in a certain way, took Solomon out of his own palace across the world and went back and pretended he was King Solomon for several years until King Solomon returned and banished Ashmedai forever. So just so you know the story, messing with a demon in those days was a very dangerous thing. Solomon did it to build a temple, but now you know why Kohelet, who is Solomon, is not called Solomon, because until he returned back to his palace, and that's also why Kohelet is so, I don't want to use the word depressing, or it's so somber, it's so almost cynical in its tone, is because Solomon was at that point in time kicked out of his own palace, and Ashmedai was living pretending he was the king. Okay, so just a little sprinkle of Jewish knowledge for everybody. But as I told you earlier, what's the purpose of all this, right? We mentioned magic. We're going back to magic here, but I wanted to just make sure that we know the message of everything here we're learning is meant to be a message to all of us, that if these things existed, are forces of energy that are not for the positive, how much more so do you need to treasure and value the divine energy that's embedded within you, your godly soul? You have the strongest, most powerful godly force in the entire universe. And not only the entire universe, period. God took a piece of himself and he placed it within each and every one of us. And he said to each and every one of us on the day we were born that the entire world, all of history, all of the future, and certainly all of the present, cannot exist in this world without you. You are indispensable. Your purpose is incomparable to anything else in existence. A demon and an angel, they literally pale in comparison to the divine energy you have within you. They feed off the little bit of loss that you have, so to speak, of the demon, and the angel certainly feeds off the mitzvot you do. But you should know you're the source of energy in the world. The divine energy God embedded within you, and he gave you a purpose. He gave you a purpose to do mitzvot. So every choice you make in the world, you choose whether to take your divine energy and uplift the world and draw godliness into the world, or God forbid the opposite and give that energy to the other side, to the side that doesn't have free choice, but just seems to be a black hole, a seeping of eating off the energy that is divine when we don't use it for its correct purpose. So I hope that inspired you, that every choice, just from the knowledge of what is out there, what was out there, and so on and so forth, you realize the power that God has entrusted within you. And what was it that Spider-Man's uncle told him? With great power comes great responsibility. So use your responsible power responsibly. Don't just drink responsibly. Use your godly soul responsibly, and make this world the perfectly holy world it can be, because God entrusted it in your hands. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. If there's any questions whatsoever, I'll be happy to answer those. But you have to ask them in increments of 4 because Jews ask the 4 questions. That's just the way we are.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Rubenfeld. It's obvious that we could have done several presentations about this topic. I put Rabbi Avi's email in the chat, rabiavi@gmail.com. I've also recorded today's session, and you're welcome. We've covered a lot of material. If you want to review it again, please let me know, and I will pass on the Zoom recording to you. Thank you again, everybody. Take care.